Hello. Yep, there it is, the big version. There's a smaller version here. It's not all so gigantic. I've done a few of these events now, a lot of them with the rest of the nominees. Before I start, I'm always surprised each time we come across other things about our books that we share. Steve was talking about the Nazis' liquidation of people with non-neurotypical illnesses earlier on. The asylums, we're about to find out that the main character in this book lived a lot of his life in asylums, German asylums, and ended up dying in a German asylum. Both of the asylums he spent his life in were used by that program to euthanize children and adults who had mental illnesses. And each time I listen to everybody speak, I think with the psychosomatic illnesses that Suzanne talks about, Schreiber suffered miracles, he imagined. God was enacting miracles on his body. He dissolved his bones, for example, and he suffered the pain of that dissolution of his bones, even though we probably would argue, I think, looking at most of us, that God wasn't dissolving his bones. And the more we talk about mental illness in general, the more commonality I think we share. When I'm asked what this book is about, it's always tricky. I always say, and I have done before, that I'm quite resistant to telling people what the book is about. Largely because, one, I think it's off-putting. One of the things it may be that the book is about a man who believes, who develops paranoia and believes that God is attacking him and is drawn to his body and that everybody else is dead and he lives in a world on his own filled with fleetingly improvised men who are put there by God to convince him that he's living in a world where he needs to engage. He manages to get out of an asylum, and then when his wife becomes ill, his wife Sabina has a stroke, he goes into a final stage of his illness from which he never recovers, and then he dies in a German asylum. And my feeling is that that may not be the most upbeat kind of weekend beach read for everybody, so unlikely to be seen in huge piles next to airport departure gates. Ready to, cheer people through a sangria drinking competition on an 1830 holiday in Magaluf, for example. So I'm reluctant in that way to describe what the book's about. I'm also reluctant in I think, particularly when you're giving a 15-minute slot, which is not a criticism. I'm used to working with 50-minute slots, so 15 seems shorter. But any amount of time summarizing a piece of work, I think is reductive in one way or another. You're going to miss something one way or another. So I kind of, I try not to do it. I don't know why. So what I'm going to do instead, rather than explain everything for 15 minutes, we could go into Freud, we could go into Lacan, we could go into the history of psychoanalysis, we could go into the history of German anti-Catholicism, for example, which is a factor of this. But instead, I'm just going to give you some reasons why you ought to read a book about a kind of miserable story, one way or another. Firstly, this book, I'll talk about the book, not talk about the writer. The book is beautifully written, right? Really, really beautifully written. Whoever wrote this book knows what they're doing, right, on the level of words. It's beautiful. It's beautifully done. As is that. There's lots of pleasure to be had on the level of the text, right? Some people will write books about the mentally ill, very good books, and the prose will mimic or mirror somehow that kind of sense of uncomfortableness that goes with supposedly mental illness, right? Paranoid people, the text must itself be paranoid. People with fractured mental thinking, the text stylistically must be fractured. We must have to read these kind of fractured. I don't feel like that's the case, and I didn't write this book like that. I wrote it as beautifully as I could manage, right? I'm a human being. I try my best, and then this is what I try to do. Not for any other reason than I think it would be silly to imagine that everybody who was mentally ill didn't have the capacity for beauty, right? Which I think is an argument that sometimes gets made. We get presented mental illnesses in order to engender in us often disgust and shock. It's very easy to think of mainstream representations of people who are mentally ill, people who are psychotic and delusional in particular. They tend to be killers and criminals and people who chase us with big knives through the woods on dark Halloween evenings. These are our psychos that we have chasing us around. Or they're considered to be people who are unlike us, in interesting ways sometimes, but not of the level where we could enjoy the story of them. Right? And this is a bleak story, no bones about it. But at the level of the text, at least, you don't have to experience the bleakness of that. So that's one reason why you should read this book. I'm using read. If you hear me say buy, that's just, I mean read, right? You can borrow it from other people, but my publishers would probably prefer buy. Buy, read, whatever. Another reason, I think, is that it has a story, right? It has a story. It's the story of a man who wants to go home. Right? This is the general gist. He leaves home one day after seeing his wife have a stroke, and he can't get back, but he wants to. In a way, it's like that. I don't know how old everybody is. There was a film back when I was a kid where a dog and a cat, and either another dog or a horse, I can't remember, they have to make their way back. The incredible journey of, that might have been Shrunken Down Little People inside in a boat, inside someone's nervous system or something, but there was one with the dogs and the cats. It's that kind of story, right? Getting people back home. And the reason that story's in there is not because I think people with mental illnesses have different stories to us, right? They are essentially us. They have the same stories. They read the same way. When we are engaging with this situation, we're looking at 6 books that have been produced on the same kind of topic. We need to kind of remove this artificial barrier where we start thinking that people have different forms of beauty necessarily, or beauty that we couldn't understand, and I think in different types of stories, and stories that we can't understand. So at the heart of this, it's not a book about delusions. It's not a list of terrible things that a person thought that you're going to find shocking and bizarre and amazing. It's a story about trying to go home one way or another. And you should read it for that reason, I think, as much as anything else. And I think in general, if you were to read this book, not casting any aspersions on your personalities, it would make you a better person one way or another. For the time in which you are obliged to empathize with the character as I've written them, right? You will develop human skills one way or another. We like to have entertainments that don't ask us to do this. We like to be shocked and surprised and excited, right? Those are things that happen to us on a physiological level. We get fight responses, etc., that will allow us to then experience vicariously things that would otherwise be too dangerous for us to experience. But also, I think that it's important for literature and for writing in general to put us into a position where we're obliged to empathize with people on a level which isn't. So say it's not entertaining. It's possible to be entertained by empathy, I think, but which isn't primarily designed to make us react in a particular way, but perhaps is instead designed to make you think about stuff and to feel things. I'm coming across as earnest. I can sense earnestness coming out of me. And I guess it must be. I've spent a long time on this book. This book occupied 5 years of my life, I think, in the writing and some more time getting it published. And there are parts of me in this book, too, when we write about other things, when we're writing about distant scientific subjects. We are in there, too. And I am in here, and I think as a form of communicative practice, reading and writing is something that we should engage in as much as we can, and not just for pleasure. Sometimes I carry the proof copy of this book around with me when I do readings, and it's a white book with no cover, no name on the front, no title, no indication of anything other than that it's a book. My feeling is that this is how books should be propagated in the world. You should be given, at the beginning of the month, a white book, everybody. And if you don't read it, you should be sent to prison. That's what I think. You don't get to choose what it is. You don't get to opt for what you like. You should read what you're given and learn. You can tell I'm a lecturer. My students, you will learn. That's 3 reasons. I don't know how many reasons you need to go and read a book. 4th one, okay, my publisher, Galley Beggar Press, is one of the only indie presses nominated for this prize. It is the only indie press nominated for the prize, I think. And it needs your support. Right? It needs you to buy books like this. Because like a lot of books that you may hear about from indie presses, it's been shopped around, right, to various publishers and who didn't want it. No, we're not interested in that book. It's too difficult for you people. You they're talking about when they say things are too difficult. That's too hard to sell for people like you. So you should rebel against that. You shouldn't have them telling you what to read. You should have me telling you what to read. And lastly, I think the reason why you should read this book is because if you don't, then I won't be able to write any more. Because I only get to write if people engage with the kind of material that I've written. Schreiber, if you're interested, there is a library's worth of material on Schreiber. There's an academic discipline called Schreiber Studies that you could look into. Okay? If you wanted an introductory text, that would be useful to you, maybe a fun way in. But Schreiber wrote his own memoirs, Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, it was called, which Freud read and Lacan read, and many of the 20th century writers and theoreticians read and wrote on. If you wanted to, and if you feel like it, just Google me, send me an email, I'll send you a reading list you can read. We can, if we want to, look at the history of Schreiber and the history of writing on Schreiber, and perhaps we all should. It's not a great rhetorical ending, but I think that'll do. Thanks.